Good afternoon and welcome. This is the 16th and final in-person Roundtable event for the Federal Housing Finance Agency's Federal Home Loan Bank System at 100, focusing on the future initiative. We're here today in Boston at the Kennedy School. Thank them for hosting us. Although as a graduate of several other institutions, I feel a little bit in enemy territory, but they've welcomed us very friendly, and I appreciate that. We are going to discuss today Federal Home Loan Bank corporate governance and system structure. We have a distinguished panel, including regulators, former regulators, scholars. We had to do one note. We did have some other attendees who had to drop out at the last minute, so we've got a little extra time to hear your brilliant thoughts and ideas for the future of the home loan bank system. As usual, this event will be live streamed and will be recorded and available on our website. And I encourage you those of you to check this one and prior events that were held. Information can be found there, and I encourage you to visit there. So welcome to the participants, and we look forward to the discussion. I'm joined today by Eric Howard, who is a principal policy analyst at FHFA and home loan bank expert. And he was going to discuss the rules of engagement.
Great. Thanks, Chris. As Chris said, I'm Eric Howard, and I will be helping to moderate the discussion today. We hope and expect that we will have an open and engaging discussion. And with that, we'd like to say that no recommendation or view should be considered off the table. And we encourage you to offer differing views about some important questions that we will be covering this afternoon. First, we want this to be orderly. As such, we will ask that everyone turn their name placard to the side when you would like to respond so that we'll know to call on you. And we will call on each of you in turn. And we ask that everyone engage in the discussion in a respectful manner, knowing that we will likely not agree on all points. And to ensure that everyone has a turn to speak and that we cover every discussion topic, if someone is going a little too long, we may interject to keep the conversation moving. Second, this review is meant to bring forward the views and reasoned perspectives of Federal Home Loan Bank System stakeholders and to highlight areas for further consideration. We ask that you not limit your responses to what would be possible under current conditions. Third, we will have a break roughly halfway through today's event. And finally, for the benefit of those in the audience, the roundtable participants have been given a list of prompts that we will reference during the course of this afternoon's discussion. We also have a disclaimer that we need to make you all aware of, and therefore needs to be read verbatim. And so with that, here I go. We have organized this roundtable to obtain your input on the mission of the Federal Home Loan Banks, including input on several specific questions that were sent to you prior to the meeting. During today's session, FHFA will not discuss the status or timing of any potential rulemaking. If FHFA does decide to engage in a rulemaking on any matters discussed today, this meeting would not take the place of a public comment process. The rulemaking document would establish the public comment process, and you would need to submit your comments, if any, in accordance with the submission instructions in that document. FHFA may summarize the feedback gathered at today's session in a future rulemaking document if we determine that a summary would be useful to explain the basis of a rulemaking. Anything said in this meeting, and that also includes reactions, nodding, eye rolling, should not be construed as binding on or a final decision by the Director of FHFA or FHFA staff. Any questions we have are focused on understanding your views and do not indicate a policy or legal position. Participants in today's roundtable may have a financial interest, whether direct or indirect, on outcomes that may affect the Federal Home Loan Banks and their businesses. As Chris mentioned, today's roundtable will be live streamed on FHFA's website and video recorded. FHFA may also prepare a transcript of today's session, which would include the names of all speakers and the organizations they represent, if any. The recording and any transcripts prepared will be posted on FHFA's website and YouTube channel, along with any materials being presented today or otherwise submitted in conjunction with the roundtable. And with that, I'll turn it back to Chris.
And you can breathe.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eric. As mentioned, we've got a great panel today. We had a chance to meet briefly before this for a quick lunch, but for the benefit of those watching on the live stream, I'm going to ask everybody to introduce yourselves. It'd be helpful if you could also state your degree of familiarity or affiliation with the Home Loan Bank system. Obviously, detailed knowledge of the system is not necessary, but to have great ideas about where it should go, but just it's helpful to have to ground people where you are. I will say on a personal note, it's a great pleasure to be joined today by Steve Cross, who we worked years ago at the old Federal Housing Finance Board, and Steve was instrumental in my view in helping to make the regulation and oversight of the Federal Home Loan Banks much more rigorous and improved than it had been prior. So it's a pleasure to see Steve here today. So Steve, why don't we start with you and we'll work our way around the table.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Cross. I am currently a senior advisor at Alvarez and Marcel, and I was previously the director for Federal Home Loan Bank supervision at the FHFA, and as Chris indicated, its predecessor agency, the Federal Housing Finance Board.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with you. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the managing director of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I guess something of a host for today's event. So it's really a pleasure to have you all here to the campus of Harvard University. My own background is actually less with the FHLB system, but my direct involvement in the housing finance system is as a member of the board of directors of Freddie Mac. And so I know the other GSEs fairly well, but less with the FHLB. So I think my experience is in governance of GSEs generally, but not so specifically with FHLB.
Great. Thank you. Mike.
My name is Mike Hansen. I'm the president and CEO of MSIC. We are the excess deposit insurer for 73 Massachusetts-based credit unions. We are the fourth largest credit union cooperative in the world. We've been around 61 years. It's a success story in terms of providing full deposit insurance to consumers in Massachusetts. I will say it's a very interesting weekend to be a deposit insurer, but I'm delighted to be here. I will say that MSIC is a member of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, as are almost all of our 73 member credit unions, and we use their services quite frequently.
Thanks. Ed.
Ed Golding. I'm the executive director at MIT's Golub Center for Finance and Policy. Before that, I've been many years at GSEs. I was 23 years heading research at Freddie Mac, but perhaps more importantly, I was at the predecessor of the FHFB. I was at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, which oversaw the then 12 Federal Home Loan Banks, and worked for a board member Larry White, and attended for 2 years every monthly meeting of the bank presidents. So it's a little bit dated, but the Federal Home Loan Banks go back a while.
Well, thank you, and I'm sure you have the scars to show for those monthly meetings of the presidents. I'm sure if it's anything like today. No. So we're here to discuss system structure and governance. As Mike alluded to, there's a few other things happening in the backdrop of the banking system and the financial sector. Obviously, that's an evolving story, and it does have, will ultimately have some impacts. And I'm sure, it's something that we're watching closely, as are others. But and I'm sure there will be plenty of postmortem assessments of what went right and what went wrong of that. But for purposes of today, I think it does underscore the importance of governance and some of the storylines that have emerged. So I think it's at least timely, and I appreciate you all coming out today. We began these roundtables talking about the mission of the home loan bank system, and I think it's a. I take it that discussing the structure and governance necessarily entail some decisions or assumptions about what the mission is or should be. So feel free to elaborate some of that as we go along. You don't have to feel wedded to just purely structure. But I think I would like to start with talking about of the structure of the system and of the banks as they're cooperatives, as we've heard. Under the Bank Act, the director has wide authority over establishing the districts and the structure. Some of it is set by statute, obviously. The director has authority to merge banks down to a certain level. The banks can voluntarily choose to merge if they did. It's not necessarily clear that merger is good, bad, or otherwise, but that'd be something you want to talk about. But Steve, given your direct involvement as a regulator, maybe we'll start with you. Do you think the system's appropriately structured to enable it to fulfill its mission?
No.
Okay,
and,
Chris.
If I say anything that leverages materials that Ed Golding distributed early, I apologize. I don't want to take any of his thunder, but I thought he had some good ideas. I mean, it's first question that I have, and this was one that Ed did raise, was whether we need to have 11 districts or whether it would be better to have a more centralized organization with branches with one governance structure. So I think that's a question that at least needs to be posed. Secondly, the requirement that each state be represented on the board of directors of a home loan bank has always given me pause. It is a reason why in the past mergers have been difficult to effectuate because the result is additional states, larger boards. The Des Moines board is, I believe, 22 members right now, and I suspect that that's larger than an effective size for any large organization's board of directors. Related to that, you have elections by state that are often very closely tied to state banking or trade associations, and there's this sense that the member is representing the entities in its state. I've always objected to that notion. All of the members should have the fiduciary interest of the home loan bank writ large at mind, not the parochial interests of the member banks. So those are a few thoughts I have in response to your question.
Okay, thanks. And we'll certainly get into more about the board structure and the processes. That's going to be a heavy focus today. But I noticed you posed the question about consolidation, but you didn't actually answer it. Did you have or was that intentional or?
Well, I do think that it would be better to consolidate. Yes, I don't. In the world we live in today, I don't understand. I appreciate the value of local representation, but you can have branch offices. You can provide local services without having a separate structure in place, a separate organizational structure in place in each of 11 or previously 12, or if it were to reduce. I don't see that that's a particularly efficient way to go.
Steve, could you, with consolidation, is that consolidating down to one bank, or is that a West Bank, an East Bank? I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, again, I welcome you asking that question to Ed Golding because he did in our pre-meeting conversations raise that issue, and my answer to your question is I think there needs to be consolidation. I don't see any reason why it couldn't be one with separate districts, but with a core organizational structure. And without going too far into this, I really think it's even tied in some ways to what we're seeing today, where you have the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco making advances to one organization that had a heavy tie to cryptocurrencies, another that had gotten itself into liquidity issues by virtue of its portfolio of securities investments in a rising interest rate environment. And with joint and several, that affects Boston, Indianapolis, Dallas, you name it, but they don't have any say about that. So consolidating down, I think, achieves some of that. I can't say that I've done an analysis that tells me it has to be one rather than two or three. So I'll stop there.
Well, Ed, you've been teed up. Would you like to express your own views in your own words?
Well, I actually I'll just agree. And I don't think any of these many of these have been discussed for many years. Some of them were discussed when I was at the bank board over 30 years ago. So I'm sure there are many authors. I always like to sort of start out just with I like geography. I always ask people how many contiguous states have federal home loan banks in them. So I'm going to do a quick. Anyone want to hazard on this expert panel? States that touch each other that each have. How many states can you go across the country and visit a federal home loan bank?
I would guess 0 are in contiguous states, but I'd have to hold up on the western states that are much larger. There might be some closer ones out there. I'm not sure.
Quickly, yeah.
We're not supposed to answer the question, so I'm going to defer.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
But I think
These are
there's at least
factual.
one, but I have to think more about it.
More than one.
Okay, right.
I'd say 4.
And the answer is 7. So for those of you who do geography, we're in Boston. If you just head down the turnpike, you can get to the state of New York. From there, New York borders Pittsburgh or Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania borders my home state of Ohio. Shout out to Cincinnati. Indianapolis, Chicago, and Des Moines. So you can get to seven of these. Very much a creature of the geography and the politics of 1932. Again, nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it's probably not, if you were to start with a blank sheet of paper, you probably wouldn't have 12 of them or 11. You probably wouldn't locate them where they were. It was a very different country in 1932. I also go back to, what I think of as a successful example is the Office of Finance is one office that deals with much of the operation of the federal home loan banks. Not all of it, but much of it is centralized into one office. And they do the debt and the capital markets. And so the question is, can't advances, just sort of given technology, why can't the whole advance infrastructure and the payroll infrastructure, why do you need 11 separate ones? So why not build towards the one? Now, whether, how you get there, but if you were envisioning a system, you clearly want to keep the local connection, but lots of, Walmart knows how to build local connections to its communities out there. So you can keep, I think, the local connection and still have the efficiencies of modern capital markets. And I think that's what you would want to build to if you were to start over 100 years later.
Okay, thanks. Mike, your organization is a cooperative, I think you mentioned,
Yes.
and your members are themselves smaller, but do you have any perspectives, not maybe on consolidation, but more generally on the cooperative structure, the bank system as well?
So before we leave the consolidation, let me just touch on that. We have to remember what the purpose is, and the purpose is advancing a deep, rich housing market that can promote home ownership for Americans. That's how I view it, because that's the easiest way to create personal wealth among our people. And so the purpose of facilitating a robust housing market, I think, is the primary purpose of the FHLB system. Now, when you think about that, in the modern era, we have to think about lending. What is lending really like, and how does it really work? And in our modern era, there's absolutely no reason we couldn't have just one of these centralized in Washington, and everything is technologically done, and all the advances are done online. And at the end of the day, I would have to ask you, is that what we want? Can we do it? Yes. Is it more efficient? Yes. Would it save on payroll? Yes. But if you're in northern Maine and you need an advance because you've got a particular housing problem, I will guarantee you that the folks in Washington, all good people, aren't really going to understand the boots on the ground reality of that housing market. Because America doesn't have one housing market. It has overlapping housing markets with different needs. And I will tell you that, Boston has a different need than Brooklyn. And yes, the states are contiguous, but having a federal home loan bank system that is diverse and that all states are represented on the board, I think is a very good thing if the goal is to improve our housing market. Is it the most efficient? No. Is it the most easy? No. Is it the most easy to regulate? No. But is it giving us the right result? And I would just say, if you've ever been in a small community that doesn't have a local bank or credit union, and you're going to go to Bank of America, I shouldn't pick on them, they're very good. You're going to a large money center bank. If you make the algorithm, you get the loan. If you don't make the algorithm, you don't get the loan and you got no one to talk to. The reason we have such a diverse banking system is that we have overlapping markets with different needs, and we need local judgment to be able to make good lending decisions that promote our economy and promote our housing market. So I understand exactly what you're saying, and I understand the efficiencies, but in the end result, I think we want to have a very diverse system making these advances, because the housing market, even within New England, the housing market is quite different in Vermont, Maine, Connecticut. It's a whole different cat, and I think having those housing interests represented is really important. Now, I didn't say that the banking interests in those states all need to be represented, but the housing people do, and the bankers and the credit union folks are there to represent housing interests, because that's mostly what they do. So I have a little bit different take on the consolidation.
Well, I want to get Chris in here, but maybe we'll come back, because I thought what I heard Steve and to a lesser extent Ed saying was that you could have regional offices or regional focus, but under one consolidated thing. So maybe we can governance structure, but we can come back to that. But Chris.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to suggest, is that we talked about what the mission is, and it's liquidity and either housing affordability, community development, and the kind of things that Mike's talking about. And I think one of the strengths of the system are the advisory councils that have root each bank in some representation in the committee, in the communities. And so thinking about a structure where you still retain that voice, it's hard to do that at a national basis. So the regional structure would do that. So the devil's in the details. So I think if you can figure out how to consolidate the aspects, the mission of the bank that it benefits from those economies of scale, but then allocate to the regions the strengths that it has in terms of the mission. So I think the details are in what are the authorities and responsibilities of the regional banks. And what you'd like to have is some ability to innovate and some ability to kind of come up with solutions that are unique to that area. And so have some sort of financial independence in the sense of how do they develop programs and responses to the community at the same time, answering to a national bank. So there might be some way to cut the baby in half to achieve both goals. But I think Mike's point is really well taken, is that the strength of the system in part is having those local communities, and how do you make sure those aren't lost in something that would get nationalized.
Good.
Yeah. I mean, it's clearly the strength of the community bank and the community banking system is not what we're challenging, and the role of those community banks of knowing their local community is important. On that, I think the question they all offer checking services, but they all go to one or two providers to help them process those checks to get to the Fed. We don't have a system where each community bank comes up with 12 different ways of processing a check. And I think it's, we've done it on the debt side with the Office of Finance. And, the question is, pledging the collateral and, getting the money, what needs local knowledge in terms of processing that? No one is we'll come back to the affordable housing programs in a moment because there's some more locality there. But the bread and butter of what the Federal Home Loan Banks were created for in 1932 was when we had mutual S&Ls, or mutual savings banks, that had no sources of funds, and we had to basically liquefy them. They had mortgages, the 5-1 mortgages. It was a very important mission, and that mission still, exists today, which is how do you make sure that they have, access to low-cost funds that the Federal Home Loan Banks can provide. But it's not clear to me that you need local knowledge on terms of what's good collateral. Everyone's using the same mortgage documents for a variety of reasons. You should be able, to be able to figure out how to get collateral, how to manage the risk of the system. And I wouldn't do it centrally in Washington. I was going to do a shout out for Consolidated in Cincinnati because that's my hometown.
I like that.
Yeah, so we can quibble with the details of where to locate it, but I think you can provide all those services. When you think of the basic bread and butter, you're not asking them to take over the lending decisions because that's not what they do. It's really just what's good collateral. Is this a safe advance to make, and is this the right product? So we'll talk a little bit more about housing and supporting affordable housing in a moment. But I go back to what Chris says. I think this can be done in a way that doesn't challenge the community bank model. And I think people are afraid that if you go, it's sort of like if you go after this, you're going to go after community banks as the next move now. And I think it's important to at least separate that, or at least try to separate it and say, no, this is not about going after community banks. This is about trying to provide better services to community banks.
Good.
So that's not what I'm saying either. I'm not worried about the Federal Home Loan Bank consolidation going after community banks, because banking, whether it's community, commercial, credit union, is so much bigger, so much more robust than most people think, that the consolidation of the Federal Home Loan Bank system will not really have anything to affect them. And I don't. That wasn't what I was trying to imply. I think the system can have consolidation in its functionality, which we've done on the security side already. You can do one personnel for 7 banks, 11 banks. You can do all of these functional things to get those efficiencies, but you can maintain local control in the decisions about housing. And one of the problems that I see in this debate, and I've never been a board member, is housing is not just affordable housing. Don't get me wrong, affordable housing is incredibly important, and the things that we need to do, but housing is an environment, it's an ecosystem. The housing markets today are so complicated, so deep, so rich. Having a functioning wholesale funding market like the Federal Home Loan Banks provide into the banks in the region allows them to be profitable, allows them to provide more home mortgages, allows them to stay in business in a way that brings services and small business services to their community. It's not the old business of making a loan and closing it and funding that particular loan. The Federal Home Loan Bank system supports an ecosystem that gives us a housing market that's probably, in my judgment, the envy of the world. And we want to keep that wholesale funding structure there to support it. But to know what's wrong in a housing market, not just affordable housing, but to know what's wrong in a housing market, you really need some local control. Now, I'm not saying 11's the magic number, but I think consolidation, you start to lose those local voices about what is needed in a certain market. If you go back to the series of banking crises that we had in the early 90s, You saw that they rolled in waves. There was Texas, there was the Sand States, and if anyone remembers those days, there was Boston and the New England banking crisis. These types of issues adversely affect the housing market. And local control is extremely important in anticipating it, responding to it, and you can't do that from afar. So it's more than just supporting local banking, because that's not going anywhere, because Americans love it, and they're going to continue to use it. So you're going to have the big banks, and you're going to have the community banks. But I think the Federal Home Loan Bank system, the way in which we respond to housing environment needs, has to have a high degree of local involvement at a decision level, which is the other organizational issue. I mean, we're talking about two different things. We're talking about the functionalities of the system, which should be centralized perhaps more, especially on the risk side. But we're talking about the decision-making as to what the overall housing needs are. You got to have local folks in control to make those local decisions. Last point, the risk factor today in Silicon Valley is a lot different than the risk factor today in Boston. And those differences, I think, would promote a diverse system with diverse leadership in different areas of the country.
Thank you. Steve, you had turned your card. I don't know whether you thought better of it or you still want to get in.
No,
Okay.
I'd like to get in. I actually think one of Mike's most provocative observations is that the central role of the Federal Home Loan Banks is to promote a robust housing market. That was its role. And in fact, it is one of its roles according to the Council of Home Loan Banks now, but it's not its only role. And according to the Council of Home Loan Banks, in addition to providing members with a reliable source of funding for housing finance, community lending, and asset liability management, as well as liquidity for members' short-term needs. I think that what we've had, and it's partly a result of statutory changes that have expanded membership to commercial banks and other entities aside from thrifts, is that the role of the home loan banks has gone far, far afield of this robust housing market that Mike talks about. And so as the agency looks at the future of the Federal Home Loan Bank system, I think one of the key issues has to be what should be the function. As far as the issue of local control, I may be totally wrong about this. I appreciate that notion. It comes up in the election of directors by state, et cetera, et cetera. Does Portland today have local representation? It's part of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines. I don't know. It might, but I'm not sure that someone in Des Moines has a better feel for what Portland needs than the person in
Portland,
Cincinnati.
Oregon.
Portland, Oregon. I'm talking. Portland, Oregon.
We're in Boston here. There's another Portland.
Thank you. That's what I was in Maine.
Yes. Fair.
And I look at the business of the banks. The Seattle Bank, when WAMU failed, WAMU accounted for a third of the advances. One member. That member was represented on the board of that bank too, and I can tell you was an active driver of what was going on there. Now that's not a community bank that needs the home loan banks to access capital markets. I think we hark back to 1932 when we think about the home loan banks, but we're not there anymore, and I think that's part of the problem. The top 10 borrowers at each Federal Home Loan Bank ranges from roughly 50% to roughly 80% of the advances in those banks. So we've got a system in which it's not the local community. They are getting services, sure, but I don't even think they're the focal point of these regional banks right now. It's the big members drive a lot of what's going on. At least that's the appearance from those data.
Ed.
Yeah, I just want to sort of agree and sort of part of the question of governance is also what do you want the footprint of the Federal Home Loan Banks to be? And if it is to serve the community banks, you shouldn't have, SIFIs being members. I mean, there's no doubt, Wells Fargo's profits in some sense must be a little bit better by a basis point here or there because they have access to the advances. Otherwise, they would use, capital markets. But in many ways, I think of the future of the Federal Home Loan Banks is to refocus it on the community banks and to have really just not allow very large institutions into the system. And that means a smaller system, but if it's a $300 billion system focused on community banks, that's okay. This idea that any institution has that bigger is better, and this desire to grow, and we'll talk about the housing goals of the affordable housing programs. There's lots of reasons people want a bigger and bigger system. It's the creature of any organization. But really, if you think of, if nothing is off the table, I would go ahead and restrict the membership to, a certain size institution. I think in my written comments I said, SIFIs are clearly over the line. That was before everyone over 50 billion became a SIFI, and maybe that's where the line should be. But they really do need to focus, and I think if you do focus it on a $300 billion institution, they'll want to consolidate for efficiency reasons. The desire. The G&A of these institutions or the non-interest earning, the expenses, if you look at their financials, have been roughly 15 basis points over time, 20 basis points this last year. If you are a third the size you are, all of a sudden that's closer to 50 basis points, and you can't operate the system at those expenses. And I think that alone would drive consolidation dramatically if you think of it as a sort of a smaller footprint. So I think there's a lot of reasons to want sort of a smaller system.
Well, there's a couple of things in there we should unpack. I do want to come back to the affordable housing program, but I like the way, Mike, you said it about the other issue was just because you can do something, maybe you shouldn't. But I'm curious as to your thinking or the panel's thinking on, you made the point, Ed, that if you a much smaller system, the members would have an incentive to evaluate whether it makes sense to consolidate it. Do we think that that's, do you all think that that's an effective incentive for that kind of decision making? Is it, or is it, because again, it goes to the director has the ability to cause some consolidation to a certain extent if she would like, but doesn't necessarily mean that it should be done that way. So I guess I'm curious, is this a decision that you think would be left to the members to decide, or is this something that the regulator should sort of weigh in on? And I'm looking at Steve, but I don't want to force you into something that.
Well, the members won't decide to consolidate. I'll say that right now. The banks generally don't want to consolidate, and
even at a third of the size, hypothetically.
Post structural change. The reality is that kind of structural change, which I am generally in agreement with, poses all kinds of issues for the home loan banks. Not only shrinking of their assets and incurring expenses that probably don't shrink proportionately, but the fact is, large member banks that take down so many advances contribute to the bottom line of the home loan banks as well. And I think that if you were to look at the data, this is what I'm remembering from 14 or 15 years ago when we were looking at this, that the large member banks more than pay their fair share of the costs of running a home loan bank. So they subsidize, in effect, the small community banks. So while I am inclined to agree that there's a lot of potential mischief with large member institutions using the Federal Home Loan Bank for their own short-term liquidity needs. How we get there, I think, is a really tough set of discussions, because there are so many tentacles in terms of costs and benefits that I don't think I can answer the question of should the agency push it, or will the members be encouraged to do it by the economics. I do think Ed's right. The economics would encourage that, but then we're also stuck with the whole, I think, statutory issue of states represented on the boards, and I mean, are we going to get there with boards of 30 people, and so. I'm sorry, I can't answer your question.
Fair enough. We're going to get to that, the question of the board in just a moment, and but I think we can all agree that Congress will fix it. Ed, sorry. But Ed, I did want to get back to your point on the affordable housing, because that's often touted as, if the system were to be smaller in any fashion, the impact on the affordable housing program. And I'd like you to just elaborate a little bit more on your thinking there. You've alluded to it a couple of times.
Yeah.
And is that the tail wagging the dog, or is that, how should we think about that?
Yeah, no, you want the governance and the structure to sort of follow the mission, which I think, and I may disagree a little bit with Mike, in terms of its role on housing and local markets. I've been in a lot of conversations around housing, and no one's ever talked about the Federal Home Loan Banks. On that. So, they're a small player in the overall funding of housing finance. They talk about the GSEs. HUD has a big role. And we can fix housing policy at another roundtable. Chris will have us host us on another one.
We'll meet at the bar.
But there was no doubt that, the main mission, I think, really is around liquidity and supporting community banks. It is not, what you don't want your governance and you don't want it to be what I think I wrote down as this idea we need to cross-subsidize. Everyone puts themselves, sort of the new vocabulary is we need to do this because we cross-subsidize these worthy people. And I'm very much for, there's lots of things I would do around affordable housing, expanding Section 8. I can give you a long list. But this is really, that last $100 million of funding into the programs, and they're great programs, and $100 million is still $100 million that's not available on the HUD budget, but it's really a mistake to allow this sort of vision of we want to cross-subsidize to drive, governance or mission of the organization. And there's no doubt I've worked in these organizations that wrap themselves in sort of the American dream, and we're doing good things. And on the margin, a lot of places people do good things, but you really have to understand what's your basic value added, and you have to be really laser focused on that. And you cannot grow just because 10% of your earnings go to the affordable housing program, as tempting as it is. And I think we have to really fight that, saying we need to be big because otherwise the affordable housing programs would be smaller. I think one thing is I would double the 10% to 20% to sort of reduce the shock absorber to reduce the shock, to provide a shock absorber, to shrinking the system by 2/3, if that's the number. I mean, these are just round, made-up numbers. So I would increase that percentage because they're not subject to corporate income tax, et cetera. So I think this, and they used to pay the REF Corps bonds. So I might add it up to 20%, but I would not have the affordable housing program drive these other issues. I think you have to start with those issues and separate them. So.
Thanks. Anyone else want to get on this before we pivot to the board governance itself? Or
Did you want to jump on this, Mike?
I would just add a couple of things. One, it's a small player in the housing market. It works. It works amazingly well. It provides short-term liquidity to financial institutions. I have personally, as long as it's not a risk to the system, I don't know why we would want to throw the big banks out, because allowing larger banks to use these facilities to effectively manage their short-term liquidity needs absolutely causes more resiliency in the system. I don't see a reason to get out of it, and because it makes the overall system stronger, the Federal Home Loan Bank system is doing its part to have a resilient housing market. Is it fixing it all on its own? Of course not. It's a small player. Fannie and Freddie have way more to do with this, as does the Fed, as does the FDIC. But we have a very important process that allows financial institutions of all sizes to have these resources. For community banks, they're accessing resources they can't access on their own. But for the larger banks, if it's fully collateralized and it doesn't create a concentration risk, now that's a regulatory problem to me, not a structural problem. I mean, we can talk about San Francisco. Should that have been 80%? No, that's a regulatory issue. That's a concentration risk within that particular Federal Home Loan Bank. But I don't see the answer to be to cut out all the large banks. I don't see any real need to do that. Maybe I'm missing something on that.
So, go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to comment more on the affordable housing programs and the funding for that. I mean, I think if we think about it's coming out of really a duty to serve. So there's a public purpose for establishing this system, and as part of that quid pro quo, we expect the system to have some social purpose. I think the allocating of some profits towards those public purposes is a really efficient way to do it, as opposed to creating these mandates that create some sort of complex cross-subsidies that people don't quite understand who's cross-subsidizing who. So I think it's a really effective way. I think Ed's point about making it larger, I would certainly support that, particularly if the system does get smaller. And I'm going to get pilloried probably in the housing community, but I think if we think about the kind of direct link between the purpose of the liquidity in the system and what those public purposes are, as we've just been discussing, and initially this was a very housing-focused system, providing liquidity for institutions that were providing primarily mortgages. So I do think we probably need to expand what the purpose is of that 20% of the profits goes toward. And in a day and age where we have community banks, what purpose are they playing? They well beyond housing in terms of small business lending and other lending to the community. So I think we probably need to have a more expansive view of what those funds would go towards. And I think this is another example where having some sort of regional structure where there is some connection between what the community perceives as need that's being unmet by other sources of funding and how that money could be best deployed would make a lot of sense. And just to, while I've got the mic, back to your point about should we allow the system to consolidate on its own, or should it be to some direction? I can't imagine there's going to be a market for consolidation that will be that efficient in terms of the things that we would care about. And there's going to be, if there's a merger, it's going to be some merger based on some convenience that makes sense, as we saw in Des Moines, and with a region that may not make sense. So I think you probably have to think about what structure for regions makes the most sense in terms of the commonality of interests. And this may be completely crazy, but it may not be state-based. And so we're going to put together Northern Maine, Mike, by your example, with Boston. what's the commonality aside from we both root for the Red Sox, right? And so is there a question about kind of, rural Northeast that would be more of a region? And this is where you'd have to then think about consolidating financially, because that region may not stand on its own financially, but how do we kind of get finances from the system, but have regions where we can have that control that makes sense in terms of commonality of interests?
Ed, were you going to?
Well, you do know that the Red Sox started in Cincinnati, so.
And there are Red Sox fans in New Haven, so.
Well, that's a reason to cut off funding, but we're getting off topic. So let's pivot to governance itself. And, I'm sure there's plenty of examples of things that are highly complicated by statute across the government, but the allocation and assignment of directors and so forth to the home loan banks has always struck me as particularly complicated and convoluted. We've got member directors that represent owner institutions of the cooperative. We've got independent directors who are supposed to be independent and bring different skill sets. And then within that, we have public interest directors, or yet again, we've got states. Each state gets a minimum of one, and they're grandfathered by a political compromise. They can't get fewer directors than they had in 1964 or some year. So recognizing that a lot of that is set by statute, and this exercise is we're going to get rid of all those constraints. But we'll talk about each of those groups in turn, and in your written remarks, many of you commented on that. But before we talk about that. Chris, you mentioned in your introduction that you've got GSE governance background in your role as a board member of Fannie Mae and otherwise.
Freddie Mac.
Freddie Mac. Oh, sorry. We got two Freddie people. Okay, my goodness. Pardon me. Yeah, that's a faux pas. That's just worse than rooting for the Yankees, I guess, here in Boston. But Ed, thoughts about from that experience and where you sit now about principles of governance, particularly of government-sponsored enterprise, that we should be mindful of as we engage on this discussion.
So the challenge in some sectors is that the Fannie and Freddie, unlike the FHLBs, are in conservatorship. And so we are operating under very special circumstances. So Fannie and Freddie have slightly differences in terms of terms and how the terms are set and the like. So I'm not, in terms of selection of board members, essentially the Freddie board is largely self-selecting with the approval of the FHFA director, which is not a small matter as our single most important shareholder. And so it's in some sense, there's not that much guidance given, I think, by charter to who should be on the board. I believe the one reference in the charter, Ed Golding would probably know this, is that there should be a home builder on the board of directors, which is something that was called to our attention under the last director, and so we actually have a home builder now on the Freddie Mac board. So I'm not sure that in terms of the guidance given in the charter and the like, in terms of who's on our board, there's much to point to. In practice, what we're looking for is not unlike the list of attributes that are listed for the directors here in terms of having collectively having a breadth of experience across the domains that one would expect a complicated financial institution would have. Some of the questions that you've asked us to wrestle with in terms of diversity and the like are not explicitly discussed in the charters or the guidance. They're obviously things that we talk about with the director, with ourselves all the time, and making sure we have that diversity. So I've gone around in circles, Chris, but where I'm coming out is I would say I'm not sure there are lessons from how the GSE's boards are currently constituted and the rules governing that, what they lend themselves here. In some sense, we have, in the one extreme, I think the FHLB system has a lot of prescriptions, and the GSE system have much less. And so somewhere in the middle is probably the right answer.
Very Aristotelian. Yes, thank you. Well, let's to start with, Steve, you had mentioned a number of times, the complications of these rules, of the statutory requirements by state as it relates to mergers, right? You'd end up with a 60-member board member, right? If we went to one bank or something, you'd have a 60-member board. I take it from your comments, though, that generally you feel that there's a risk to extra large, board, so what is the optimal board size and vis-a-vis where, and obviously it runs the gamut to some extent from Des Moines, which is a special case following the merger with Seattle, where it's particularly large. But in general, in principles of what do you feel the board optimal size should be?
Well, of course, I'm going to evade your question somewhat. So I'll first state that I don't think that rules are in any way sufficient to establish an effective board. It's all about the people on the board and their character, their questioning, their competence, and their responsibility for ensuring that the Home Loan Bank operates in a safe and sound fashion consistent with its function, its mission. That said, when I have read studies about governance, I tend to see board sizes more from 8 to 12 or 10 to 14 than 20 or 22. So, I mean, I do feel like we've all been in committee meetings before, and at some point they get unwieldy. And it also, as I stated earlier, my biggest concern is that the interest of the board members must be the best interest of the bank itself. And the concern I have, frankly, is that too often it's what is in the interest of the members of the institution. They are the shareholders and the customers. And so, without revisiting too extensively history that no one wants to hear about, I'll talk about a couple of things. In 2005, there was a meeting of all the Home Loan Bank directors. And at that meeting, I was there to represent two initiatives that were underway. One was anti-predatory lending policy. And the reason for that was we were starting to see that some of the home loan banks were investing in MBS that were backed by subprime mortgages, some of which we also thought were predatory in nature and certainly poorly underwritten. The other initiative was an effort to increase retained earnings at the home loan banks. Now, retained earnings play a role at the home loan banks, unlike retained earnings at commercial banks. And that is that because the banks are cooperatives and members buy stock and they buy it at par, and it is redeemable at par, and it's always been anticipated that it would be redeemed at par, and irrespective of statutory guidelines, often upon demand, that stock purchased by members can't absorb losses like capital is supposed to do, because if it does, you break the buck and you can no longer redeem the stock at par. So we had an initiative underway that the one form of capital that could actually, at the home loan banks, that could absorb losses is retained earnings. Understand that at this point in time, there was a particular home loan bank that had well over $100 billion in assets and had roughly $15 million in retained earnings. This is at a time at which the New York Bank had just experienced a loss of $185 million on its investments in certain manufactured housing-backed securities. And I was going to each individual banks, including the Seattle Bank, but all of them, saying we need to increase retained earnings. And so you need to have a policy to do this. Well, all I can say is that the chairman at the time, Ronnie Rosenfeld, started to give a luncheon address. He was being shouted down over retained earnings and about anti-predatory lending, and he said, Steve Cross is back here, and he's speaking to you after lunch. And so that was that. I send you to the American Banker, I think it is August 25th of 2006, where a picture of me is on the front page, and the Home Loan Bank directors are quoted as saying that I'm arrogant, and because I want them to do these two terrible things: adopt a policy that would keep them from buying securities backed by predatory loans, and increase the retained earnings. And that does inform where I stand. If they are really interested in the interest of the bank, they're looking at those two issues and saying, does he have a point there? Instead, they're saying, this is going to reduce my dividends. And that's my concern about governance at the Federal Home Loan Banks, is that we have to be focused on what is good for the bank, and I'm not convinced that the structure, independent of whether it's 10 or 22, is established in a way that has the fiduciary interest of the Home Loan Banks top of mind. Sorry for my soapbox.
Well, we knew it was coming. No, but I hope you will recall that Alicia Castanet and I were firmly behind you in that effort. And if it's any consolation, the banks are in a very different position today.
Yeah.
And as I alluded to earlier. So thank you. But Michael, go ahead.
So I'm with you 100%, and I am sure it's not the right structure, and it doesn't do what we want it to do. And part of as you're thinking about what we do from here, because it does need to change, is we have to go back and look at what is a Federal Home Loan Bank. It is not a private bank. It is not a private company. It is a quasi-public company. It's the best word I can come up with it. It's part stockholders. It's part financial institution executives, but it has this broader public purpose. And so the board has two competing organizational principles. In a quasi-public agency with a housing mandate, you need lots of voices, and you need lots of people in the housing area, not just affordable. I keep saying that, but affordable is probably the most important group, but housing policy, economics, a home builder, I think that's a great idea. People who are in that field, and you need lots of voices. But you also need financial institutions there who are putting the capital in and using the services. Now, they're going to put the capital in because they want the services. The services are enormously valuable to the successful operation of the banking system, large and small. But they shouldn't be a majority of the board. All the financial institution executives should be no more, in my judgment, than 40% of the board. 60% of that board should be people who can be the counterweights to those types of issues about my institution. Now, those financial service executives, I know a lot of them in Boston, they're all good people. They have a fiduciary duty to their institution. So they don't want to reduce that dividend. And it's not just greed, it's they're doing their fiduciary duty. But that's why they can't be the majority. There has to be a broader voice. But now we have this need for lots of voices and participation and authority. That's why advisory committees don't work. And we also need the ability to have the financial institution executives heard, but not in control. So the 50-person board, or no, I'm joking. You're going to have a large board, and that board has to be in control, but you have to run the institution with a management committee where the members rotate in and off, and maybe that's 10 people, and they're actually doing the day-to-day management. But the big policy decisions should have this larger force. Is it messy? Yes. Does it take a lot of time to get consensus? Yes. But I think that's the only way you're going to craft an organizational structure that can meet the public purpose of what this system is supposed to be. So I do think it needs to be restructured dramatically.
So, that is another aspect of the statute where I think that's what you're recommending is 180 degrees from the current statute, which I think says, I'm looking at my counsel over there who'll correct the record if I misspeak, but it's the opposite, where independent directors are at least 40, but no more than half,
Yes.
or have to be less
I'm
than half.
flipping it.
So,
My proposal.
anyone else want to weigh in on what the optimal sort of ratio or whether that's important or?
Well, I mean, it's part of the question, even though they're not publicly traded companies, there are some principles of what you want a publicly traded company to be. And there's obviously a lot of centers, including up at Harvard Law School, that just studies and writes about board governance. And one of the things, it's both about size. I think Steve, talked about sort of optimal size. The other thing is not having staggered boards, having more turnover and competition for the board members. So, sort of supposedly best practices, whether this translates into the structure is something I think you need to think about. But best practices on a public board would include everyone standing for election each year, 1-year terms, so that you could, potentially have competition, other people putting themselves forward if they don't like the direction of the board. I don't know how, it's hard to really imagine that, you can't have a hostile takeover the way you might, or, there are plenty of activist investors who do provide discipline on the board. It's difficult to replicate that. One of the things I suggested is just sort of having the FHFA step up and just approve all public, the slates, not necessarily electing them, but people who want to be nominated for the public interest members, and it could easily be more than half, have them at least being aired by FHFA. You would have to publish regulations. It can't just be, sitting there and saying, I like this person, I don't like that. But you could impose sort of I think the regulator may need to provide some of that discipline that the markets or shareholders would otherwise provide. I don't know how you get that from the current structure.
And just to be clear, are you saying for the independent/public interest directors or for the members as well?
Well, I was thinking for the independent ones, but you could do it. I mean, somebody, if you don't like the CEO of a community bank, some regulator already has that in their job description to make sure that person is not there, the FDIC or the state regulator. But the question is, could you take a more active role in sort of shaping the board? You could worry about diversity of talents and the like. On that. Again, you'd have to do it through regulations and have clear criteria. But I do think FHFA may need to provide that sort of what I'll call market discipline.
So, Chris, I'll be a little less wishy-washy than my first answer, which is I will say that you asked me about the GSEs. I was thinking about what lessons from the GSEs. But I do think from the regulations for the Federal Home Loan Banks, having independent directors and having that group, which in my mind, the way I think of them as folks who are more focused on the mission part, is a plus. And the GSEs don't have that at present. And as a result, I think you can see that get lost on the boards of the GSEs. To Mike's point about what the right balance is, I'm wrestling with that because I think the challenge here is, and that Director Thompson has been clear on this, and sort of what I've heard her tell the GSEs and tell the public, is that we have two missions. We have a mission to promote affordability, and we have a mission to absolutely promote safety and soundness. And in some sense, you have to have that represented on the board as well. And at the risk of being too simplistic, we might think of the member directors as focused on safety and soundness, and the independent directors focused on mission. And so, in some sense, the question is, what's the right balance between those two? And obviously, you want every director to have all those things forefront of mind, because that's every director's responsibility. But in some sense, where you come from, where you sit, is where you stand. So I'm not sure, Mike. I mean, in some ways, that leads me almost to a 50-50 split as opposed to a majority, because I do feel like having folks who are focused on the business of the banks is critically important. But you don't want to have the mission voice be too small. But so I think we're kind of, again, we're close.
Exactly. One thing I may have mentioned is I don't think the independent directors should be elected by the members who put the capital in, because it's not a regular bank. So it doesn't do us any good if the independent directors are in fact a subset elected by the same members that are electing the financial service. I'm really looking for true independence. And if we can get that, 50-50 is great. I mean, I think I'm not adverse to that. But right now, the independent directors are in fact still dominated by the members who are electing them. And you're really not getting, I think, enough divergent views to get a better public policy result. So some are going to be, maybe independent directors are appointed. I think the regulators should have a role in that. I don't know how we're going to figure out how to select them, but I think this election that's dominated by financial institution executives, including my members, I don't think the whole board being dominated by that process gives us that diversity that we really need. So
I understand that those of us who lived through the finance board's attempts at appointing the directors in the past, you can see the records at 2003, 2004. It was not a covered itself in glory in those days. But Eric had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to get your thoughts. We've been talking about more voices. What about the voices of member directors? I mean, should there be a member director for community banks? Should there be one for CDFIs? Should there be one for credit unions, insurance companies? I mean, is the diversity of member voice, is that something you have a thought on?
I put that in my outline. I think that those categories are very different. Big bank, commercial bank, community savings bank, credit unions, insurance companies. I think they all should have at least a voice on that board, but within that institutional half, if we will. I think that would create more diversity in the decision making and better decision making as a result if you had that.
So that would be a regulatory requirement.
I think all of this requires statutory requirements.
Okay.
I think at this point,
sure.
given my understanding,
Nothing.
I don't know it the way you do, but the statute's going to have to be changed. But I thought that was part of the exercise as to what we want to see at the end.
Right.
So, Mike, let me just picking up on something that Chris said about the safety and soundness focus. I mean, I hate to put you in the hat of the member. We had, unfortunately, some of the other panelists were representing members, but since you are the member person here today, I mean, do you have a sense of, I mean, you're obviously advocating for a 50 or more split for independent directors under your definition of independence. But I mean, how do you assess from what you can see, and I hate to make this about the Boston Bank, but I think it'll inevitably be about the Boston Bank, but the board's focus, I mean, how is it split between safety and soundness and mission, or is that a false split, or how does that?
Let me talk about the Boston Bank. Great boards over the years, great people. I've known them, great bankers. Good people doing a good job. But I think, as Chris said, your view is where you sit. I might have gotten that wrong.
Where you sit is where you stand.
And where you sit is where you stand. And I think institutionally, all of these types of quasi-public organizations that have this broader mission, they do better with more voices in control. In other words, the 50%, has to have real authority. That's why the board gets too big, and you have to manage it with a smaller group on a day-to-day. But yeah, I think that these are good people doing a good job, but I don't think we are meeting our housing goals as a society, and the Federal Home Loan Bank is part of that as well, and I think we can do better. And I think these organizational structures will allow us to have better safety and soundness, better voices, better, mission creep. I think you said, we don't want mission creep. We want to make sure that the decisions that we're doing are more effective, and the way to do that is to bring in more diversity in the decision-making component of the board structure.
Steve.
Well, in my written comments, I recommended 50-50 split. I do think that there needs to be a greater representation of independent directors. I don't know that I'm necessarily opposed to 60, but I did feel that. Secondly, I agree with Chris Boslin that we don't want the FHFA to be appointing the independent. I shouldn't say we.
Yeah, don't put that in my mouth. I was referring to an incident in the past. And see the disclaimer that Eric nicely read earlier.
Anyway, but I like the notion that I think I heard from Ed that you publish a request for nominations from the public, and as part of that nomination, you establish certain standards that must be met, including experience in one or more of these following categories. I think those categories could include what we normally attribute to member directors. There's no reason in my mind that you couldn't have an economist from MIT who is very well versed in financial derivatives and interest rate risk management stand as an independent director. The responsibility of it would be the responsibility of each bank to have a full set of competencies satisfied by the slate of members that they put up for election. As for the selection, I'm sort of still stuck on it. Probably has to be members electing the independent directors, but not the members nominating the independent directors. But those are my thoughts on those.
Interesting. Thank you. Engrossed in the conversation, I've colossally mismanaged time. We were supposed to talk about the independent directors before the break, but we're going to probably push that to the after the break, and we'll talk more about that and perhaps the nomination process. But before we leave, I forget who mentioned it earlier, but it was certainly in the written materials that several of you, the state focus of the election of the member directors, is that still appropriate? Is that desirable, whether it's the grandfather provision or otherwise? Should somebody? I think someone had recommended it's at-large sort of voting or district voting for all directors, but maybe I mischaracterized that. So, Ed, was that?
Yeah, I mean, I still go back to 1-in-1 board. So, it's good to have a derivatives expert from MIT on the board, but you're not going to find 12 of them or 11. So again, some of this question is how many boards are we talking about here? So I'll go back to the pitch for one board if we're starting with a blank slate on that. At that point, and I think Steve summarized it, there's a role for FHFA to sort of be the first, level of review and make sure that, enough representation is being put in front of the members. I think at the end of the day, it has to be member voting. I don't know how else it is a sort of a mutual type of organization. There's no doubt. The question is, how much does FHFA? It has enough power to get outcomes. If things look like they're going off the rails, you do have a lot of authority, as you know, to shape the future of these organizations. But I would think I would break down the states. I would just have everyone, and I would break down the residency requirement. If you want someone from University of Cincinnati has a very good business school. I put a lot of pitches in for Cincinnati here. I'm not paid by them anymore. But if there's no reason why Boston can't have a derivatives expert from the University of Cincinnati on its board, I think I'd break down a little bit of that regionalism that was very prevalent in 1932. Doesn't seem to be as useful now. And the members still get, if we have 11 banks, it's still voting by the members of that bank. But I don't think we should have, restrictions based on states.
Mike, any reaction to that?
So, I mean, Chris mentioned regions. I mean, my concept is that it doesn't have to be the geographic states, but mortgage markets are different, and they're very different between various regions. But northern New England's very similar. So I mean, you could still do some kind of regions in the various districts that would accommodate that. And in terms of the independent directors, there's no reason that it has to be members that elect the directors. You can have appointments, even though that's not an easy thing. You can have appointments by the board. The board can appoint a slate. The other players and the independent directors can appoint or nominate other independent directors as vacancies come up. So there's ways of doing this that you'd never do it in a normal publicly traded company, but that's not what this is. So there are some other ways where the independent directors can be truly independent and can perhaps self-select their future once the first grouping gets put in. Novel, but the whole Federal Home Loan Bank system is novel. I mean, there's not much out there like this. And so I think there's ways we can do it. I wouldn't jump to member voting, because then I think you're not going to get the diversity that I think we're all talking about getting on the independent side.
Just, I guess, my 2 cents. I think going back to the question of the ideal board size, I mean, I think Steve's right. I think, my experience is like 12 to 14 members. Other than that, it gets to be unwieldy. It's hard to know your board members. You need to have a collegiality there to work together. And if you're then at that scale, having quotas by state, having quotas by category of members gets awkward. And so it seems like you could have a mandate that says that collectively the board should represent the interests of the different member institutions and the different geographies without having to be so specific as to states. And as Mike said, I mean, I think there's nothing necessarily magic about Vermont versus New Hampshire versus Maine per se. I mean, you may know better, Mike, given differences in state regulation, but it would seem to me that having a mandate say that the board collectively should represent the interests of the geography without being so quota-driven would be best.
And if this just dawned on me, maybe we flip it. Maybe the advisory board becomes the state representatives and not the board itself. There's other ways of getting those voices into the corporate C-suite without necessarily linking it to a seat.
Right.
And so, but I think the concept of geographic representation over the housing market is still important in some way.
And I don't know the function of these advisory boards well, but it seems to me that you do have those as entities. They know the bank. They know the bank's business. I don't know if there's a role for them in terms of preparing a slate, say, of independent directors. I mean, that might be a group that knows the business well enough and thinks about across the kind of spectrum of what you want to have represented, that maybe there's a role for these advisory councils in terms of proposing a slate. If you want to still have members vote on them as opposed to them determining the slate, you have these other groups help develop that slate.
Okay, with that as a teaser, we'll come back to that after the break. Let's take a 20-minute break, so it's 2:21, so we'll be back at 2:41. Thanks.
Okay.
Welcome back to the Federal Home Loan Bank System at 100 Roundtable on corporate governance and the system structure. So I think when we left off, we'd been talking about member directors. I think one of the things that's been challenging for me is we're kind of talking about several different topics. I have them all orderly on my page, but so we talked about member directors, but let's dive a little bit more into independent directors if we can. So we can take this wherever you want, but I thought we would start with what is independence? And we've been touching on that a little bit about how independent directors are nominated, independent directors are elected. I was wondering if any of you had any comments on that.
Well, I'll jump in.
Great.
I think
Microphone?
I think we have to change the independent director structure that is being used now, and I think we have to find a nomination or election process that creates a divergence between the financial institution CEOs and directors and the independent directors. And I think at the end, the goal, as I mentioned earlier, is to get as many additional voices into the decision-making of the organization, because I think we'll get better decision-making. I think you'll get better safety and soundness decisions. And I think everyone will be enriched by that kind of diversity. Now, how you do that, I do believe it has to be a separate system than the election system, because if it's just an election system by members, the financial institutions will dominate that process, and just natural human behavior, it'll be people they know and are comfortable with, and we might not get the housing diversity. Now, how we do that, I think it's an art, not a science, and I think we're going to have to think some creative ways of doing it, whether it's appointed, as we mentioned before, whether that group becomes self-selecting, maybe the group as a whole is self-selecting, but I think you definitely need directors that are unaffiliated with the decision-making at the financial institutions.
Okay.
Hopefully I dodged your question sufficiently on
No, that's
how to
great.
do it, because I really have no idea.
Okay. Well, does anybody have any thoughts on how to do it?
Well, we talked about this a little bit. I do think that there should be a process that has been vetted through notice and comment,
Okay.
whereby people are nominated as independent directors from outside the system. And I want to be careful, because as I told you earlier, some people have viewed me as arrogant in the past, and I don't want that. There are many great independent directors now.
Yes.
I look at the board. There are many great independent directors. So anything that I'm saying is not intended to impugn qualifications of existing independent directors. But I agree with Michael that having the process come out of election through the members, and sometimes nominations through members, I think is problematic in terms of having true independence. I also question whether or not we in looking at independent directors, whether I don't know quite how to characterize this, but one of the stakeholders in the system is the taxpayer, and how is their interest represented on the boards as someone who's sort of independently thinking in terms of the role. I'm going. All of this comes back to the role of the home loan banks to me, and who's actually asking. So, how many federal funds have you sold in the past month, and what percentage of the federal funds supply is coming out of the federal home loan banks, and how does that advance the mission critical interests of the federal home loan banks, and is your maturity of your consolidated obligations lengthening or shortening? And if it's shortening, how is it matched against your advanced business? There's all kinds of questions that I'll tell you, I can't figure out exactly what's going on, but I have a feeling that the federal home loan banks are engaged in a lot of lending that sort of falls outside of the simple advances to support housing finance business. And I want to see some independent directors that are asking about, why are you doing this? And I think that takes you away from the members nominating these folks. Now, I know that some of the banks, maybe all of them, have advisory committees that may also be part of this process, and that may work fine. But I really like the idea of having an opportunity for members of the public to raise their hand and say, here are the qualifications I have or this person has to fill this role, and As I think has been said before, I don't think it has to be limited to people within the confine. I mean, to me, it's crazy that that it has to be limited to the geographical confines of a particular institution. Now, how they are selected, how they are actually then appointed, I'm with Michael. I have to punt on that. I said before that if that process of nomination was sufficiently independent and there were controls on it to ensure that there are that the skill sets are appropriate, then electing it from the members, I can abide by that. I'm a little bit less troubled than Michael, but I understand his point, and I just don't know how else to do it because I don't really want the regulator to be appointing the board members. I think approving a slate is okay. I'd also like to see in both the independent and member directors slates that are larger than the number of positions to be filled. There's a lot of I've heard a lot of people say, "Gee, we don't want to ask people to run and then be turned down." But I mean, we're all big boys or big girls here, and I think that should be part of the process. That there should actually be some choices involved.
Well, that brings up another a related issue, either under your proffered sort of notice and comment approved process, or even but also under the current process. What's the role of transparency here, and do you think that the process is currently transparent enough? Meaning, do people know, for example, that there were 2 slots and 2 people nominated and 2 people were elected? Oh, gee, it was the same. I mean, is there a role for greater transparency here? I don't know. I've never voted in one of these elections, so I don't really know.
So the problem with it being an election is that the financial institutions dominate the number of votes cast. And again, I'm with Steve. These are people I've known most of my career. They're good people, and we have some great, and this isn't an aspersion on anybody, but just by the nature of that, the people who will be elected in that environment will reflect the relationships and the interests of the people who hold the votes. That's just the way it works. And I don't think there's any way around that if it's an election process. I can't think of one. But I do think the independent directors, depending upon how we define that, I do think the independent directors have to be selected in a way that is separate from the member directors. And I think they have different interests. Whether it's an advisory board that nominates them, the regulator signs off on them, and then there's an election by the advisory group, there's an election by non-bank. I think you're going to need 2 election processes or 2 selection processes in order to maintain some balance of independence, just as a practical political matter, I think.
I have a bit of a problem with you. Are you looking at my notes? Because
No, I don't have good enough vision to see your notes. So
Steve touched on a number of issues, and you just touched on it too. But I thought, Chris, in your comments, you talked about the role of the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee and their potential role. I mean, they review the nominations, but do you have more specificity? Do you have more thoughts on how the AHACs could be used to facilitate this process? I mean, are they truly independent? I mean, they're not members. So if you could expand on, and anyone else that might want to.
I'm not intimate enough with the process. Sorry, I'm not intimately familiar enough with the process to go into specifics. But what I think that group, to me, represents it's intended to represent the community, and it by nature will be more diverse in its perspectives than the members will be. And so it seems to me that we're looking to have more independence reflecting the community and greater diversity, that if it's a choice between the members who are board directors who are voting for this and giving that group some more say, it seems to me that's a natural group that's already created, that has that diversity, that has that interest, that has that expertise and familiarity. I don't really understand the process well enough to get into specifics, but I think, Mike, you talked about both in your preview questions and earlier, the value of diversity of perspective. And if we look at the member, as I scan through the boards of directors, they don't look particularly diverse. So it does seem to me that this is a really way to get that diversity of perspectives, diversity of opinions, and it's a resource that already exists that could be tapped to help with that process.
Okay.
All of the research, and I'm sure you've all seen it, the more voices we get in the decision making, the better the decisions are. I mean, it's going back 30 or 40 years in all of the research now. And the only way to get diversity is to go get it, because financial services, and this isn't an aspersion on anybody, as an industry, we really lag in diverse faces and diversity within our ranks. And whether that's gender or race or ethnicity or whatever, we have to go out and get the diversity and bring our industries along. And I think that's where we are right now, and I think we have to do that. And so when I say diverse voices, I mean diversity in the sense that we talk about now in those issues, but also housing, construction, economics, asset liability management. We really need experts from different fields to participate in the decision making in a meaningful way. And I think we're going to have to go out and get it.
You touched on my next question about the diversity of skills. Are there other, and because the law identifies skills that independent directors should have, are there other core competencies that you can think of that we should be focusing in on?
Well, I haven't had a chance to read the list in the law. I should have done that. I didn't think of that. But I think when you look at complicated financial institutions like this, there are a lot of competencies that are necessary for a board to render independent judgment. I mean, one of the things we talked about, you look at Enron. I hate to go back that far. They had one of the best boards on paper you could imagine, but they weren't doing the work. They weren't doing the job. They weren't asking the questions. They didn't have independent thought, and we had a massive collapse. So you need people who can provide collegial checks and balances over what management is saying, regardless of the institution. So you need an accountant. You need somebody who's going to be there. You need an asset liability specialist. You need a housing economist. You need somebody in affordable housing. You need someone in regular housing. You need this diversity of skills, and this is really complicated. So there's a lot of folks you're going to need to be able to draw in a meaningful way, and that goes up against our concern about having a board that's too large and unwieldy. But we've got to find a balance to do that.
Do you have anyone have any thoughts on board training? What the banks are doing? I mean, you talked about some hard skills, also some soft skills. Should this be mandated? I mean, is there any way
Yes.
that the agency should
Training. As a group, however many banks we have, they should be being trained as a group with the regulators' involvement. They should be trained individually, and there has to be a high focus from a corporate perspective. Now, most of these companies are run pretty well, and I think they probably do have a board training program, but board members have to get together on a regular basis. They have to break bread. They have to be trained. They have to learn skills that they don't have already, and they have to be very engaged in a collegial challenge of what management is providing and what the regulator is providing too. There's got to be that dynamic, and it's got to be a job.
So, we talked about FHFA creating standards through regulation. We've sort of talked a little bit about slates, and in some sense, this is the hard work that has to be tailored towards the system. So, but just an idea, if you want more people with housing and community skills, Maybe one of the requirements is they've served 3 years on one of the AHACs, and then you get 4 people applying, but you have 3 of your seat, so you come up with, members can still vote at the end. I at least haven't thought of a way of getting around that. But if one of the requirements is that they've been 3 years at an AHAC, at least you bring the diversity of that representation and sort of a career path. I'm just, and it has to be written down, has to be thought through, has to be in regs. But you need to figure out, I think, sort of what Mike described, how do you reach out to the broader community? If, there's clearly what does it mean to be an outside Sarbanes-Oxley talks about the requirements. I don't know if that's been adopted for your accounting skills, but there are plenty of ways of making sure you have good accounting skills on the board. I think you have to go through and figure out what makes for, an acceptable slate that meets all, these different criteria, and then let the members vote. It may be that the screening even though you don't want FHFA to do it, it's very possible that the screening process comes up with only one slate. But at least you've gone through a process that's, transparent, that people who are interested in the system can speak up. And I think it's working through those details that will get you the diversity of skill sets that you need.
The banks assess, or at least most of them assess the board needs, so to speak. So Steve, under your idea of a notice of solicitation for nominations, would that be part of it? I mean, would you envision the banks sort of identifying what they're looking for with some specificity, perhaps along the lines of, what Ed's saying, if, we've got to meet these criteria and here's...
Well, I think that we have a pretty good idea of the skill sets that should be represented on a board. Asset liability management, various forms of risk management, some familiarity with collateral policies and collateral valuations and protections, legal, accounting, housing, affordable housing and community development. I think maybe compliance, regulatory compliance, and so. Going back to an earlier comment by Ed, where the board is refreshed every year, you're making sure that the slate that's up has that. Now, I think that in some way there has to be some transparency on this person is up here because he or she has this set of skills, and it's one or more of those listed skills, and the entire slate covers the full gamut. If, in fact, you have boards like today in which only part of the board rolls over every year, then I think the bank should be part of identifying what skills are absent at the present time and need to be included in this slate. But if you're really doing this in a transparent manner, that's already going to be known, because you're going to know who has what skills and which ones are missing as you go forward.
Just a small point, but Eric, you had started by asking the question of what are the list of skills needed, and the list that's in the notes for here, and Steve reflected them, are mostly financial management, audit and accounting, risk management practice, derivatives, et cetera. You mentioned affordable housing, housing policy, community lending, small business lending. That's a set that's missing now, I think, from the formal list. And so I just think as you think about that criteria, we should make sure that those more kind of what I would describe as more mission side or business side as opposed to risk management side are reflected. And just to echo what Steve said, I think if you're looking at, you want those characteristics reflected across the board and not just a seat for this role and that role. And people may have different strengths that they bring to it. So hopefully you have a slate that reflects that as opposed to recruiting for a specific seat, and that's my role. You want people to have broader perspective of their role than just that one perspective.
And the only thing I would add to that, I agree with that, is that I'm torn on the one-year election. I mean, it sounds very democratic, it sounds very good, but many times you could run into a political situation in which a board is destabilized politically in 1 year. And there are political battles that go on in these types of organizations. So historically, I've usually said 3-year staggered terms so that a third of a board rolls over every year. Gives you more stability, but it doesn't give you the democracy. So there is a balance that needs to be there. But everybody being elected every year could result in some instability depending upon what happens. We have to be thinking about that.
And since with respect to the member directors, at least, I mean, it's very difficult to control that. There's no slate. Well, there is a slate, but it's not. I mean, you kind of the bank has to take the luck of the draw, so to speak, right? To some extent. So, are you advocating for this list of skills? I mean, should be reflected within the independent directors, or I mean, how do they take that into?
Yeah, it's both. I think the member director again. I'm starting from the premise that it's not just all driven by states, and that depending on whether we end up with separate election processes for member and independent directors, which is something we haven't resolved at the table, but has been presented.
We have time.
I think the slate of nominees should be reflecting a certain set of skill sets. And I think in my written comments for the future, I identified certain sets that might be appropriate for member directors and a set for independent directors, some of which overlapped, but some of which were different. And I don't think I included small business lending, but conceivably, depending on where you end up with what constitutes community development activity, that could be part of the list as well.
I'm not aware of what is currently done, but in private boards for publicly traded companies, there is a cottage industry of search firms that are not transparent, but serve a role in the market of balancing some of these issues. So that's, as I said, it gives me pause because it's not as transparent and the like. But that is something to consider. And I'm not sure which banks may already do that, but that's another resource that publicly traded companies tend to use.
Okay. So we've been talking about member directors, independent directors. Let's talk about a subset of the independent directors, and that's the public interest directors. And so the Bank Act notes that at least 2 of a bank's independent directors must be public interest directors who have at least 4 years of experience in representing consumer or community interests on banking services, credit needs, housing, or financial consumer protections. So are the statutory qualifications required to serve as a public interest independent director rigorous enough to ensure true representation of consumer and community interests? So I'll toss that one out. Does anybody want to jump on that? I have no takers.
Get the ball rolling. I think that I would qualify as a public interest director, but I'm not sure that I think I should qualify as a public interest director. I'll leave it at that. I mean, I've spent many years heading compliance policy at the Control of the Currency and the FDIC. in my advisory career, I've worked a lot on consumer protection matters, fair lending, CRA, and other consumer protection laws and regulations. So I think I fall into that category. But I think that it's really so I think it should be probably more tailored, and I think it should be more tailored towards the core mission of the home loan banks at its inception, which is financing housing, and if you want to make it at least one member be representative of affordable housing, I think that would be appropriate as well. So, long story short, I think it might be stated a little bit too broadly,
Okay.
and I think that there needs to be some particular focus on affordable housing in support of the affordable housing program or the community development lending initiatives of the home loan banks. But I'll stand corrected by my
that was
panelists.
Steve. That was one of my follow-up questions. Is should someone with government service be excluded, or should they be included? I mean, does anybody else have any view on that?
Well, they shouldn't be excluded.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
At least as independent directors.
Okay.
But
But as the public service.
as far as public interest, again, I think that I find that definition as you read it to be very broad, and my point that I fall into that category is only that a representation that's a very broad definition, and I think that at a minimum the agency needs to be thinking, what do we want? What is it that we want out of these public interest directors that's separate and apart from what we want generally from independent directors? And only after asking that question can we say whether or not government service should or should not be sufficient to fall into the category.
I would just add, I would exclude currently elected officials. I don't know that you have to do that. I think the conflicts of interest that would apply in that situation would probably push that category out anyway. But I would avoid bringing any political aspects into the board structure.
So what about, moving a little further down the road, what about the difference between nonprofit and for-profit? Like if you have a affordable housing developer, someone who works with a nonprofit organization who has acquired this experience through nonprofit experience, should it be limited to those individuals or for-profits that's open to them also?
I don't see any difference if the director is good and has a skill set and is going to do the job. I don't, again, it depends on the specifics as to whether there's a conflict.
Okay.
But absent a conflict of interest, I don't see the difference. I would want both, frankly, if I could get them.
One thing that occurs to me is it's hard to distinguish or to separate the written specificity of the language from the process. And I feel like if there's a process that is going to generate a good set of independent directors that are trying to achieve a certain goal, you don't need to have language that's too specific. If you don't trust the process, you're going to need that language to back it up. And as the language gets more and more specific, they can also create hamstrung people, and they don't necessarily reflect changes in the environment. So I would err towards the side of thinking about a process that's going to generate a slate that fits the goals of what we're trying to accomplish, as opposed to honing the specific language.
Well, I keep, going for the specific, but
I didn't go to law school for a reason.
so
I think I agree with Chris's point, and ultimately, I think it leaves you with the question: if you have a robust and transparent approach to selecting independent directors, do you need to have a separate category within that of public interest directors?
just we talk about at least two. Are two enough? Should there be more than two? Should there be four? Does anybody have any views on that? Public interest directors. Yeah.
As long as the independent directors, including public interest directors, are a majority or a little bit more than a majority, depending upon what the number is, I don't know that we need specific numbers of it.
Okay.
Again, we're going to end up, we've got all these wish lists. We're going to end up with a board of 30 people.
Right.
And we have to be careful of that, although we need these skills, in my opinion.
But I mean, in some sense, if you just, this discussion would lead you to having 7, independent director, 6-member directors with a board of 13. I mean, that's sort of what I'm, to put numbers, and on what I'm hearing, that would, would make for a good board. And then the question is, of those 7, what's the, how do you establish a process that you get the skill sets that you want? Clearly even the 6 of the members should have, not every CEO or board member of these banks have the accounting or compliance skill sets or the collateral skill sets. Again, this, the art of putting together a board's not easy. I talked about a search firm, not my preference, but, can FHFA, through a nominating process, basically say this slate seems robust enough that it meets these general criteria that are in the law. That is, I think, what you want, but it does put the onus on FHFA to, set up a process.
Steve, earlier, before the break, you were talking about, for lack of a better term, and I apologize, the fiduciary duty, if you will, of the duties of a director, member or otherwise. How would we define that? Because I think under that idea, if it was more clear, whatever clear means, then some of this is sort of beside the point. I mean, not beside the point entirely, but I mean, the concerns might be mitigated if there was a clearer duty. I mean, how would we go about expressing that?
Well, I think that it's multi-pronged because I think it really goes to the fundamental question of what is the appropriate role of the Federal Home Loan Bank. And when I mentioned fiduciary duty, I was looking at it from the perspective of asking the members of the board to be asking themselves, is this bank operating safely and soundly and in conformance with the appropriate role of a Federal Home Loan Bank, which is a government-sponsored enterprise that is free of taxation, that has priority lien status, and enjoys the benefits of the implicit or implied guarantee. And so, to start with, I want to have boards where the directors are just asking questions about why are we doing this? Why are we supplying as much federal funds as we are? Are we making? Are we issuing COs at the with the right maturity structure given our asset, or are we engaged in some bets here? And so that's what when I talk about fiduciary duties, I'm doing that, but that also fundamentally gets to whether or not the role of the home loan banks is to provide liquidity for short-term needs or liquidity in support of housing or some other set of noble public interest goals.
Yeah, well, okay, fair enough. I was thinking more of so I guess what you're saying is clarity of the mission would then, and an obligation to address that, whatever the mission, I don't mean mission currently today, but mission broadly defined, whether that's liquidity provision or housing or whatever. Then if that was clear, then we could then people would be more, we could have directors sort of more accountable, be more focused on achieving those ends.
Well, that's what I'm saying,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. So,
Okay, so we're going to move to, I want to talk about diversity on the boards. And when we talk about, we've got diversity of thought, we've got diversity of skills, but let's talk about gender, race, ethnicity. So are the Federal Home Loan Banks doing enough to bring diversity onto their boards? If so, what are they doing? And if not, what should they be doing? And I keep staring right at you.
he was anticipating.
Yeah. And
I'm, I guess I'm the easy target here. No, I'm kidding. Well, so I can't speak to what they're doing because I'm not on the board, and I know I know them well enough to know the Bank of Boston is a really great organization. What I will speak to is the end result, because, and I think all of us, including them, need to do more. And diversity is a lot of things. It is, of course, gender and race and ethnicity and where you live and
disability,
socioeconomic,
right.
And are you affordable housing, regular housing, and we need to go out and make it happen. And diversity is also experience. It's also we talk about asset liability and all these other technical skills and accounting. That's diversity too. But I think we all have to do more to go out and make that happen, because the end result is we get better decisions. You just do. I mean, there's just no. What's a famous case? The Cuban Missile Crisis. You get better decisions when you have more folks in the role, and we all have to go out and make that happen. There's no easy way around it.
So can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
I'm supposed to be, is there disclosure today based on any of these
Yes.
categories?
yes. In the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion reports, the banks are required to report on the diversity of their boards.
Okay.
So we're saying you're reporting on that.
So there's at least reporting. Okay.
And what's the number?
I
Where
don't have
are
that.
we?
I don't have that in front of me.
I don't
Sorry.
either. So,
But-
but I think we have to do more. And I think it has to be an affirmative, not nice to have. It has to be an affirmative part of our effort to create a more effective board.
Okay.
I mean, the diversity will reflect the diversity of members, right? So there's part of this has to do with the diversity of members as well. And part of the challenge here, right, is that you're relying on the bank members themselves to be diverse, to be able to produce a diverse slate. And then the independent directors obviously provide an opportunity to go beyond that. So it actually has to be a goal of the organization, the banks themselves, to be able to develop the diversity that then can be drawn upon for the board. But it certainly has to be a factor. I think the independent directors are going to play an important role in providing the diversity to the extent it doesn't exist in the banks themselves.
And the members do not have to be the CEO. They can be any officer of the community bank. Is that correct?
Yes, and board members too,
And board members.
Yeah.
Okay.
of the institutions. So, I think that's been a challenge for the bank. It's not the most diverse group of individuals to select from. So do you have, I'm going to push this a little further, do you have any recommendations on what the banks can do to influence the nominations for member directors?
Well, you could get more CDFIs as members, just as
Good idea.
one way. I mean, it's it would help. I mean, there are, the question is, what are the 10 things that you can do today that would help? And if every Federal Home Loan Bank, helped sponsor 2 more CDFIs, and and each of those, and we had 1 CDFI, on each board, it would be a different makeup very quickly. And I do think you have, in 1950s, it was fine to talk about pipelines. It's time to stop talking like that and just doing it. and figuring out what are the 10 things you could do differently tomorrow, because I don't think it's a pipeline question.
I agree.
Anyone else on this issue?
No, I think it's a great suggestion.
Okay. You ready to move to governance?
Sorry. Just enjoying the conversation. Let's pivot to everybody's favorite topic.
The Cincinnati Reds? No.
Since executive and director compensation, and how that plays into governance and what we're talking about. Obviously, the statute gives the finance agency, puts us in a little bit of a strange position where we have to approve compensation arrangements for the top executives, but we're not allowed to set a range. So it's kind of a strange little quirk of the law. But obviously, compensation can be an incentive to get different skill sets that may not be there. But if you're talking derivative expertise, maybe that's a different price point in the marketplace. But so should there be limits or restrictions on the compensation executives and directors receive at a home loan bank? Ed?
Well, I'm still going back to one bank, so it's an easier question.
On the executive.
Well, no, I mean, with one bank, it just strikes me as very wasteful to have 12 banks and 12 relatively expensive folks. And this is, again, part of it, so the answer, yeah. So it is partly, it seems like you should be controlling, if these are community banks that you're serving on a very relatively simple business model, that you should be asking yourself, are these compensations appropriate? I think it's part of the public purpose. Where the Federal Reserve operates on much lower pay scale, and does asset, and has a $9 trillion portfolio that it manages. It can print money too, so it's an advantage. But I do think you have to look at things like the Federal Reserve System and ask, why is this so different in terms of compensation?
If we limited it to Federal Reserve scale compensation, I mean, does that inhibit the bank's ability to recruit the kind of people that you seem to be talking about need to serve on the banks, notwithstanding that it's a simple...
Are you talking about the board or the management? I mean, this is...
Well, a little bit of both, but let's start with the board, and we can get to management in a bit.
And again, this is just perusing a few statements. The board doesn't seem to be that out of line. It's on that, but I'll defer to others.
Well, the last data I saw suggested like the median chairman of the board was getting about $140,000 plus certain expenses, and board members were about $108,000, and committee chairs were somewhere in between. And I don't know that I see that as being problematic at the board level. I think the issue is at the executive management level, and partly it goes to the all of these things come back to what do the banks do. I think the banks are engaged in a lot of activities now that may warrant higher salaries, but should they be? And in its core function, lending advances heavily collateralized by mortgages to support housing finance, that's a pretty straightforward business that probably doesn't require a $1 million salary for 12 presidents. But again, that's sort of said in a general term. I'm not questioning whether any individual is worth the salary he or she may be getting. But if you step so if you step back from the particulars and ask, what should the home loan banks be doing? And the reason I keep coming back to that is they are government-sponsored enterprises. There is the implicit guarantee. There is the super lien. And I believe that the function of the home loan banks should be narrower than it has been. And in that narrow realm, you don't have to compete with commercial banks for the talent. And I'll stop there.
I guess I'll offer a few thoughts. I mean, one is that you certainly want them to have access to the talent they need to be able to run their business safely, soundly, and effectively. If you get into narrowly defining what those levels are, you can cut off the enterprises from getting the talent they need. What I would think about was whether or not the system as constructed is going to, create an incentive to overpay people. It seems like the fact that these are member-owned cooperatives, there would be some incentive to not have your profits absorbed by the staff. I don't know in practice whether or not that's true. I guess there may be some evidence to suggest that the folks are overcompensated, that perhaps it's not working. So I guess that's where I would start. To what extent do we believe that the current system is overcompensating folks? And is there some information relative to what the comparable set of organizations are in the financial services realm, and how are senior executives paid relative to the distribution of salaries in that space? Are they overly compensated or not? And then think about what kind of incentive structure is needed to bring them more in line. But you do get in trouble if you set sort of absolute limits on salaries when you're trying to recruit talent. And I don't know, the Federal Reserve is a public entity, and so it's different in the sense, right, that this is a private for-profit entity.
Well, the Federal Reserve banks are
Private.
I mean, I think they would say they are. And I mean, they have shareholders.
Okay.
They have board. Their board's elected by, J.P. Morgan votes on.
So how do they get away with paying much less? I don't know if the record can read your eyebrows.
It's markets are a mysterious thing. I mean, what do you mean by get away with? The Harvard professor doesn't. What's the top Harvard professor get paid? Harvard seems to be doing okay.
I don't know, but I think they actually get paid pretty well.
Not as well as the Federal Home Bank. I might as well light the room on fire. I do not believe we view these correctly. I don't think these are regular banks owned by bankers who put capital in. That's part of it. This is a quasi-public agency, a GSE, that has a great amount of government taxpayer subsidy. Not direct, but I think that's what we're all talking about. So 2 things. One, I think for the executives, you want to have, as a broad construct, they need to be able to recruit the talent for the complexity of the banks as they are and as they're going to be. And we can't have this conversation with any specificity when we haven't decided what the role is. But let's assume the role is as it is now, and they broadly support the housing market through the financial system, and they do what they're doing now. You have to allow the institutions, however many there are, to compete for talent. These are complicated organizations. If you read the Torillo's white paper and you talking about some of the asset liability things that he's talking about, which is really a good thing for you as the regulator to be thinking about. These are really complicated things. So you wouldn't want to limit the ability to attract talent. Whatever that number is, I can't speak to it. So on executives, I would give a free hand. On directors, I would say, we would do well if we could convert the view of these directors to more of an honor and a public service as opposed to a paid position, because it's a mindset as much as it is a number. And I don't think that's the position we have now. I think a good board could be attracted at a much lower compensation level, because we got to change the reason they're doing it. They're doing it as service to the industry, service to the country, service to the housing market. And I think the compensation for directors should be, by the institutions, brought back to a more reasonable level, in my opinion. But don't restrict the ability to attract talent at the executive level. One of the problems, and this is not a problem, it's not a criticism, but when you pay well below the market, you get what is an institutional career path. And the Federal Reserve does this really well, but it is an institutional career path. It is a regulatory career path, and it should be. Given what the Fed does, we kind of want these federal banks to be part of that Fed process, and they do an extremely good job. But I'm not sure that's what we want in the Federal Home Loan Bank system. I think we need more of a market-driven system in the executive level to get the kind of performance we want. And that doesn't mean they need to go out and compete, for J.P. Morgan, and then Jamie Dimon and all, these. We're not at that level, but I do think a purely capped bureaucracy kind of pay scale will result in a different group of people running this, and we might not get the innovation that we really want to see in the housing market from these banks. Because I think you're sensing, if I sense correctly, is we all think we need to do more about housing, affordable housing being part of it, but we need to do more, and we need to really have these banks be innovative and well-run and safe and sound and good asset liability. You can't do that when you restrict the compensation too far.
So first of all, I'm not sure what innovation means here, so we'll come back to that. But, I would argue it's not, if it is complex, goes back a little bit to what Steve says, it shouldn't be complex. There should be a fairly simple business model, to run. Whenever these issues come up in Washington, they point out that NASA has, truly has rocket scientists who really did put people on the moon. I don't know how complicated that was, but they managed to do it under the federal pay scale. So they do have rocket scientists there. I'm not sure why this is so complicated. I mean, I understand, Black-Scholes and option theory. You can get that from a calculator now, or and I would imagine most of the CEOs of the Federal Home Loan Banks couldn't derive Black-Scholes either, nor should they on that. But it's just not, cultures grow up to, pay sort of grows up within the culture, and people don't want to challenge it. And I think the question here is, should it be challenged? And I think the answer is yes. I also would point out, I don't think it's a huge issue relative. I mean, you could add up all the costs. I think the operating costs of the whole system was like $1.5 billion. I think if you went to one, you could probably, cut that by a third. You probably, the amount of savings by capping executive comp is much smaller than that. So in some sense, it's outside of a political issue from an economics. It's probably not that big. But I would go back, and Steve has worded this well. It has to do with the mission. This is not, complicated. The management should be able to ask, is our duration zero? Are we taking any interest rate risk? And if we are, why are we taking interest rate risk? So, I mean, those are the types of questions and by the way, you do have a regulator, I hear, too, who are asking these types of questions and who are, addressing that. So it's not like you don't have other layers of protection. So I don't really think it's that complicated. It shouldn't be that complicated. And I think even today, I don't see a lot of innovation. Maybe I'm missing it. I go back to where we started. It's a very important role It provides liquidity to community banks. It has, the ability to take collateral that capital markets won't take. It has the super lien that also protects it. It's, for a very localized community bank that is dependent on the deposit base of that town in northern Maine, this is a great supplement, and that's what it was designed for. Fancy derivatives, callable advances, might make Wells happy to partake of those products. I don't think that's a product that community bank in Maine really needs.
Anything on this side? The flames kind of petered out over here. I don't know. Steve, you want to take the bait? You already spoke to this.
I agree with Ed because he agreed with me.
Kumbaya. No. Well, Eric?
Sure. So, we've asked the four of you a lot of questions, and we really appreciate all the input, the responses, the willingness to participate in this. I'm going to toss it back. Is there something we didn't talk about that you would like to talk about? It doesn't necessarily have to be about structure or governance, but if it is, that's great. But I just want to give you that opportunity before this is the last roundtable, in-person roundtable. So if there's something that we haven't talked about.
Can I'll defer to others, but the one thing that I think Mike sort of alluded to it, but one of the questions is is what happened over the weekend. The financial institutions that collapsed all had large Federal Home Loan Bank advances. And I think that's an issue that people are asking about. You could take two sides. You could say it was a good thing because they would have had problems earlier, but for the Federal Home Loan Banks, and that's, Federal Home Loan Banks sort of stabilized the system. I think that's where Michael sort of was coming from. There, I think, is a view that I'm willing to bet, if you wandered through the halls of the Federal Reserve, was the existence of the Federal Home Loan Banks that are not connected to the regulatory Fed system actually, made it a worse problem. That it would have been better if the Fed had been in there earlier, that if they had used the discount window, that a acquirer could have been found in September instead of worrying about what happened on Friday. And I think that's an issue that I don't have the answer to, but I think as you think through the role of the Federal Home Loan Banks, and I'm sure you're doing this, there are a lot of people in Washington who have been dealing with these issues that you sort of need their input on. Is does the Fed view this source of liquidity as a good thing or a bad thing? And that's that's their it's for the Fed and for Treasurer to answer that question. So I imagine you probably have had those conversations, but I think that's an important part of this discussion.
Yeah, and that's obviously something that will be discussed to great length and examined going forward. The facts are a little different in each case, but the issue is there. So.
Well, just for purposes of discussion, I don't think the Fed and the FDIC should answer that question. I think they should be part of it, but I think the Federal Home Loan Bank system, the GSEs, all of the federal regulatory agencies ought to be looking at that, because when Silicon Valley Bank failed, 6% of its assets were in Federal Home Loan Bank. 6% is not sufficient to create the kind of disruption in the operation of that bank that the FDIC frequently says. The emergency liquidity aspect of that is extremely important in the world we live in now, because Silicon Valley Bank, as of Wednesday, was a well-capitalized, well-run bank, and there was no reason for the regulators to go in. They got caught, we got caught, everybody got caught. This is what happens in the modern era. Deposits are incredibly volatile. And when you have a bank like Silvergate, Signature, Silicon Valley, they have a narrow book of business in a tight industry with enormous amounts of uninsured deposits, because you're a high-tech startup. You raise $30 million. You put it all in Silicon Valley Bank. $250,000 of that is insured. The other, $40 million is uninsured. 80 or 90% was uninsured. They had an unstable business model in a world that's now digital. And these tightly knit people got scared on Wednesday, and by Friday it was insolvent. And that's the world we live in. In that world where deposits are so volatile, the banking system as a whole needs resources and liquidity, because it actually helps institutions avoid failure when they have this access to short-term money for whatever purposes they need for liquidity. All bank failures, 95% of bank failures at the end of the day are caused from a liquidity run. Whatever the source of that was, having a safe, sound, secure system to add liquidity, of which the Federal Home Loan Banks are one part of it, really does avoid more problems than you see. And unfortunately, we've got three big ones, and we have an environment in which people are trying to figure out what went wrong and who's at fault. But my view, from my experience, is the source of that liquidity is an amazingly important tool for the whole system to avoid these types of traumas. Now, the FDIC didn't like it, because that 6% of assets will go out first in the receivership, because the Federal Home Loan Banks are fully secured. But if they weren't fully secured, then they wouldn't be able to get access to the reasonably priced funds that they then use in this process. So I think it's a good thing, as long as it's not overburdened. And I think you mentioned, a bank that had one of the Federal Home Loan Banks had 80% of their draws in one institution. That's a regulatory problem. That's a concentration risk. That needs to be dealt with. But that doesn't mean we need to get rid of that system. I think the system works by and large. A little bit different view, but
Yeah, I was just saying it's an important, and less the FDIC, more the Fed. That institution, ultimately it's a congressional decision. But you do have, the Fed thinks of itself as the ultimate provision of liquidity in the system.
it is, yeah.
On that. And so the question is, do you want these two, where are the frictions, where can they work together? And I think getting them to work together, I think, will be important.
Agreed.
Yeah, well, I wonder, and this is just a question, whether the existence of the Home Loan Bank advance allows or hides from the regulator what might be a pending problem and just kicks the can down the road. That's my concern about that. And Eric, in terms of your question, one issue we haven't discussed, it was not on the agenda for today, but just to throw it out there, is the issue of holding companies with memberships in multiple banks, and what implications that has for competition among the banks for the business of those members that are affiliated, and whether that's a good thing. Should an organization be able to be members of multiple home loan banks? My answer to that would be no, but
I think Ed has a
that's the
solution.
question.
No, I was going to add, well,
With one bank, I'm just saying.
Yeah, that would be a solution. The other issue, that most mortgage finance now is done through independent mortgage banks. The cash flows coming off of servicing is a very, I don't know if I'd say it's complicated, but there are very few people who really can figure out all the cash flows on every prepayment and every foreclosure. But there is a question that you grappled with, but I think people need to grapple with it again, is given that most mortgage lending is done by independent mortgage banks, do they need liquidity in times of crisis? Now, they can get that indirectly through Freddie and Fannie, and Ginnie can be that source, and that might be the answer. There are ways that those GSEs could do it, but there is the question of, does the Federal Home Loan Bank have a role to play.
Anything else? Anyone want to bring up?
World peace?
Okay. Okay, so something that we often do at these roundtables is we do a little bit of a round robin just at the very end. And so what's the single most important change that you would recommend statutorily, regulatorily, with respect to the structure or the governance? So,
Assume we can only do one thing.
right.
That's.
One thing.
I will say that in past roundtables, people just agree with the prior person and then add their own. That's how this, if you go last, you get more, but we're just trying to prioritize.
So, I mean, I would go to, this, whether this is one or two, I'll leave to you to decide, but
27 points.
one bank no bigger than $50 billion members.
Well, I'm not going to agree to that. I think I made that clear. Although it's a good idea. I would change. I would take. I think the system needs to change its culture, and I would take the word affordable out of housing. This needs to be a housing organization, of which affordable is probably the biggest and most important part of it, but we need to get back to the core principle of what they're doing, and that is providing financing and housing services so that we can do a better job of ending up with the right housing policy for our country. And I think it needs to become the focus, and the board recomposition will help us change that culture, get away from bank financing as our primary goal. I think it's our primary tool, but that's not the goal. How is that for 7 things in one?
Well done.
Pretty good.
Chris?
This is all a game of how can you, take something complex and make it into one thing. So, I mean, I think in some ways the fundamental job is to define clearly the mission of the Federal Home Loan Banks. And I think, liquidity is clearly the origin of the system. But I think what we're wrestling with in terms of the public purpose beyond that liquidity is how do we define that mission? And Mike, you've defined it clearly as housing, not affordable housing, but housing. I think that needs to be really wrestled to the ground. Obviously, as a houser, I think housing is really important. The financial system needs to support it. I think in this case, it's broader. But I think once we define that mission, we then have to make sure that the governance structure is supportive of that mission, which is liquidity and it's affordable housing, it's community development, it's all the things that community banks need to support. And so defining that mission and making the governance structure align with that to make sure that the individual banks are being directed, or individual bank is being directed with that mission at central is important. Did I get it?
Well done.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, I think mine is broadly consistent with Chris's. I think that we need to define the appropriate role of the Federal Home Loan Banks. I'll go beyond what Chris said, and that would be that it should return more to its roots in providing liquidity in support of housing finance rather than short-term member needs, liquidity needs.
All right. Well, great. All we have to do is solve mission and culture. No. This has been great. I really appreciate the discussion we've had. It's a fitting capstone to the in-person meetings. We have 3. It would be remiss not to mention that we have some upcoming virtual roundtables. I think maybe this week. This week. So they'll be streamed only. Dealing with access to the system and issues that unique to largely, not the 48 states, so Alaska, Hawaii, and territorial issues. So we had one last week with Puerto Rico, but we'll be doing several more of those.
Thursday, it's Guam and Northern Marianas. And then after that, I believe it's American Samoa and Alaska. And
See, once you start naming them,
I know.
you're at risk of forgetting.
I would suggest next
We
time,
talked about Hawaii and Alaska.
let's do those in person next time, and I'll just come back.
So we do have an inspector general, so we got to watch out for that. No, but this is, again, I want to thank you for your thoughts today and the comments that you submitted in advance. I would say we are going to, after the virtual roundtables, we'll be having another listening session where, similar to the one that kicked this off, I think, Steve, you spoke there, but it'll be another, give people a chance, stakeholders a chance to respond to things that they may have seen or thought about since we started this. In addition, currently on the website, the portal is open for submitting new additional written comments. So I think those will be particularly helpful. We've heard a lot of great ideas in the verbal format, but any additional thoughts that you might have that you'd like to submit, I'd certainly invite that and invite those watching on the stream to do that. As I mentioned, this is the 16th. I want to just thank our team again. They've done a lot of work to pull these things together on relatively short notice, and it's been a tremendous help to those of us who sit here. But obviously, there's a lot of work that goes into the back, both the people running the events, the teams in the bank regulation Office of General Counsel, notwithstanding the disclaimer. I'm sorry. But there's been a tremendous lift, and people have done a great job. So I want to thank them, thank the director for kicking this off, and thank those of you who watched on the live stream. So thanks again, and appreciate it.